You're listening to Edge Radio TV. The views and opinions expressed in this program are that of the hosts or guests, and not the Edge Radio Network or its advertisers or affiliates.
E.R.A.S.E is an organization. It's a movement. We're talking about unity. We're talking about unity. So we're aimed to taking down the system of race by educating, enlightening, informing, and positively debating with those who have counterpoint.
Welcome to Edge Radio's Talk About Unity. I'm excited today because I've got my buddy back, my co-host. It's like missing one of my legs when he's not here, but he's back today. So welcome to Talk About Unity, and we're going to have a great time today. I'm going to let him talk to you in a second, but I want to tell you what we're going to do today, set the landscape for what's going to happen today. We've got, once again, George Middleton. He's going to come in a little bit. We talked last week about getting critical about race theory, and you gave me a good post today that we're going to have to be able to expand upon that later on. But it's about race theory. Everybody's talking about critical race theory, and of course, on Talk About Unity, we're always talking about how we can take some of these divisive theories, such as we believe critical race theory is, and we can put them in context so that we can unify. So we're going to get that to the show, but hey, I'm just happy to have not only my guest, George Middleton, but also to have my partner in crime back, Richard Jennings. Welcome back, Richard.
I'm so
Welcome
good.
back.
It feels so good to be back. I had an opportunity to go to Colorado for a few days. And
chilling. And when I say chilling,
it was
Texas
chilling.
wasn't cold enough. He's going to Colorado.
4 degrees. But then the temperature rose all the way up to 45. I mean, you could snowboard
rose to
in
45.
a short sleeve shirt, but it was good. Food was good. Friends were good. Animals were good. Slopes were good. There is not. Hey, I'll just say this: as far as Colorado goes, there is not enough diversity in Colorado. I mean, it was
really.
Yeah, seriously.
Well,
I mean,
maybe it's where you were. Besides,
I went everywhere.
Dark-skinned people ain't that fond of skiing and snow and stuff.
Why is that?
Because we haven't been exposed to it.
We come
from a climate of warmth. We're closer to the equator.
No,
my Nigerian ancestors wasn't no slopes to ski.
Whatever. This is 2020, 2021, right?
Yeah, so that means
as
you got. And the deal is, yes, and I would say, so it means you got to invite me to snow ski, and you have, and I've rejected because when I got that Texas freeze, then the last thing I want to do is think about, let's go to a place where we can get more of that. I'm not really feeling that.
No,
so
I could see you on a snowboard. I could see you on a snowboard and your sweet girl and my sweet girl just sitting by one of those giant bonfires they have out there. Snowmobiling, man, I'm telling you.
That sounds good.
That was
fun. And that's the thing. Okay, so we're going to talk about unity. That's what we're talking about. Because maybe, you do that, and we load up a bus of people like me and say, let's go and try that, and then maybe we can start something new. Because that's what integration's about. We need to try to do more integrated things.
Do it because you want to, not because you have to, right?
Yeah. So, but I got a desire to, because otherwise I'll say, hey, I'm gonna sit here at home.
For 25 years, my friend said, you gotta go snow skiing with me. I'm like, I'm not into the cold. I'm not into the cold.
So you had to do the same thing.
So yeah, and then after I had all those heat strokes, I said I have to desire something that's not going to hurt me. So instead of being out in the heat, so I started doing the cold thing. He said, come on. And so I'm hooked. I mean, snowboarding is my drug. I mean, I love it.
All right, so that's our move today on Talk About Unity. Unite on the slopes.
Yep.
That's our move today. All right, so let's get to my buddy, my friend, cognitive behavioral therapist, author of Can You Be an American and a Color Too? Welcome to the room, George Middleton. Welcome, George.
Yes, sir.
You're in. All right.
Yeah, I don't feel like talking now. I feel like going skiing.
Come on.
Hey, you're in Indianapolis now. You're a little more used to this kind of frigid weather. How is the cold? Did y'all have a cold snap like Texas did? I mean, or is that every year for you all?
Yeah, we got hit. The previous winter was a lot milder, and this feels more normal, more regular.
Okay.
But yeah, we didn't get it as bad. The way you all have it, you all never got it that bad before.
No.
Well, you had bad one time like that before, right? Several years back.
None of us ever remember that. This is like the coldest we've ever remembered.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, we're glad to have you back, and I don't want us to run out of time like we did last week because we got a lot to cover. Because you, me, and now we got Richard back. We're gonna sit and we're gonna have these discussions. Last week we were talking about getting critical about race theory, and George, because he's been in this work for quite a while, has a unique perspective, and we've got to discuss that. We've got to be able to understand where he's coming from, how that plays into today's world, and then just as he says, gives you this cognitive approach, because he's what I call the guy who does cognition. All right, he is the engine of cognition, and he gets you thinking, which is really good stuff. So let me give you a quick review on where we were last week, some of the things that we talked about. We'll bring you up to speed so that you can join in with where we left off last week, and then we're going to get deep on these tenets. Now, George had these 8 tenets of race ideology, because one of the things that we talked about is the difference between this idea of critical race theory and race theory. All right, because race theory kind of is just our view of race ideology, and George talked about that extensively last week, how race ideology makes you believe certain things about groups of people, and so it makes you subscribe to a skin color paradigm. So that's the race ideology. And so we said that, and so what we called it was getting critical about this idea of race. To be critical about that means we start questioning whether or not that is a good idea that makes sense, or can we, more than anything, can we understand it? All right. So that's when George came up with these 8 tenets of race ideology. And I'm not sure if he would characterize them that way, but that's kind of like the name I put on him. He had these 8 ideas that support race ideology. And so I'm going to cover those. We'll cover up through 5, and then we'll start with 6, which is kind of where we left off last time. All right. His first one says, humans are not a race, we are a species. He made that very clear. He talked about the fact that we are genetically based and not based on this contrived social construct, which was created and called race. And so race was something made up by man that is not valid, but however, genetically speaking, we are a species. And so if you wanted to put that in the proper context, George says we're a species, which I understand that totally, and I agree with George on that. All right, point 2, race is not real. I love that one because it's so simple. Everybody understands that race is not real, but people still have trouble trying to understand, well, but if race is not real, then why do I call you black? Why do I call you white if it's not real? And so sociologically speaking, then George puts that in context and says, well, because we've created this construct to make you believe that it's real, and so therefore you use it. So race is not real. All right. Point 3, he says, everyone can be prejudiced. We all have biases. And I watched a show from Indianapolis yesterday where they had Dr. Marks on. He talked about implicit bias and how we have all these biases. And so everybody should understand that from their own viewpoint, that, yeah, there are things that I think about people immediately upon seeing them. We start size people up. And Dr. Marks yesterday talked about how we do that out of convenience because it is able for us to cut to the chase. However, sometimes the danger is we cut to the chase and we're wrong. All right. So, but we have to at least be able to acknowledge that we all have these ideas, these biases about people. And point 4 is that not everyone can be racist. He says to be racist means you have systemic power to implement your prejudice. And so, so that's one. We might even come back and talk about that one because that's a good one to talk about too, because it talks about power. Because the question would be, in context, does everybody have some power? And so that might be another question, right? So that might be a question. We'll talk about that. But that was number 4. Number 5 says anyone can be racist as long as it supports white supremacy. So his point there is that race and racism are basically defined as being support legs of the idea of white supremacy. And so that's another one we could talk about too, because we talk about white supremacy. Everything is done to support the idea. And while you say white supremacy, I would say support the idea of race, because race then was defined as creating a hierarchy which made white at the top. And so I think that's what George, and he can explain that, but I think that's what he means by white supremacy, that white is placed at the top of the hierarchy. And so that is very true. That we know that historically that's true.
Yeah.
All right, so George, give me a comment. Do we hit all those? You might need to do cleanup behind me on that, and anything that I said for those first 5. Let me know what you think.
Well, first of all, I have to say, Carlin, you complete me.
Hey, that's a different show they do here on Edge Radio where they talk about the. Hey, we gotta watch that. All right, we're good. That was.
Hey, I say that because do you remember the skit that President Obama did when he spoke and then the comedian behind him was interpreting?
Yeah, I do. I remember that. Yes. Yep.
Yeah. Because that's why I depend on you, because you can really break it down and to the layman's language. When I'm speaking, people look at me with a strange face, and then they'll look over to Carl like, "What did he say?"
I'm his translator, you know.
Yeah.
Hey,
break it down.
Yeah, it reminds George when I was in Marine Corps. I was in Baghdad, and we had translators. So they're speaking. I'm your translator, because George, and that's what I mean about George being this cognitive engine. Because man, George says stuff, and I have to mull it and go, George, put that in English. And that's a good reason why I'm not. I never was that super intelligent. But I'm a translator. I go, can you simplify that for me? And I can get that from George, and I can communicate it to the regular people. So, well, good. That's outstanding. Yeah. Well, hey, George, that's good. Yeah. I'm ready. We've set the stage for the show, but we're going to take a break. We usually take a break when we first come in, 10 minutes in. So we're going to take a break so that we're ready. And this will be a good point for us to start talking about number 6 that you talked about, where you identified that people may not be racist, but they are racial. And we're going to let you explain when we come back after this break, okay? All right, great.
Sounds good.
Let's take a break. Don't push me because I'm close to the edge.
I'm trying not to lose my head.
Hey, this is the Talk About Unity show where I bring the talk.
And I bring the unity.
And together we talk about unity. Unity is what matters. Come on. And right now in our country, that's what we've got to do. So we do that here at Talk About Unity on the Edge Radio Network. Be with us every week.
It's going to be awesome. It always is. And I tell you what, the more we seek first to understand, then be understood, we make progress.
And we like to do that. And that's why everybody's on the brink. We love what we do at Edge Radio because everybody's on the edge. We bring them back from the edge and we bring the unity. So we're glad. Edge Radio Network every Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. Talk about unity because here at Edge Radio Network, truth still matters.
Edge Radio TV is holding auditions for new show hosts. Are you a subject matter expert, professional, influencer, book author, thought leader, or business owner with an educational or motivational platform? Then we want to meet you. Send a link of some of your work to edgeradio20@gmail.com and be sure to put audition in the subject line. Join the Edge Radio TV family. Edge TV, because truth still matters.
Welcome back to Talk About Unity, and we're talking about unity in the context of critical race theory today. We've got our cognitive behavioral therapist, I'd say our friendly cognitive behavioral therapist, George Middleton, out of Indianapolis, and man, we're being excited about what we're going to discuss today. Even during the commercial break, we had a deep discussion, and we're probably going to have to get back around to that. Let's go with our plan, and then we'll see. But sometimes, just that free-flowing thing works, all right? Yeah. But we want to get to point 6 where you in George's 8 tenets of What do you want to call those things?
I call them 8 tenets of racial deconstruction.
Oh, wow. Okay. Now it's really getting deep. I'm going to have to translate that again. 8 tenets of racial deconstruction. See, now I've got to translate because George wrote his great work, Can You Be an American and a Color Too? Does a great job of explaining not only that we are in a racial paradigm, but the requirement to deconstruct that racial paradigm. And that's the work that he does. And so understand, he's talking about not just the idea. Most people talk about racism, and they're talking about the symptoms of this thing. And everybody's talking about the symptoms, and everybody wants to treat the symptoms. And it's kind of like you got a cold and you're sneezing and coughing. Well, I got some stuff to stop sneezing and coughing. Yeah, but what does it do about the cold? The cold's going to still be there. I'm just going to stop the symptoms. And so that's what George is talking about. George is the first person I've ever heard talk about, but we've got this problem, and here's the solution to stop the problem, period. Not deal with the symptoms, exactly. Stop the problem. So that's racial deconstruction. So be clear on that when George talks about that. And I think that gives our listeners context on some of these other things that George is going to talk about, because that's where he starts. And most people, they start further down the road. George starts at the very beginning saying, well, but this ideology is wrong. All right. So now I've explained George once again.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said.
All right. So point 6, where you identify people may not be racist, but they are racial. Explain that one for our viewers and listeners.
Yeah. So, if you identify by color, black or white, because those are the only 2 identities in race ideology. They're not cultural, they're racial. If you identify by either of those colors, then you're not necessarily racist. That doesn't make you automatically racist, but it does make you racial because it's a racial identity. So the meaning and purpose behind that tenet is to get people to understand that even if you're not intentfully racist, that everything you do is going to be racially based. Everything you perceive is going to be perceived through your racial identity. And most of it occurs, a large majority of it occurs on a subconscious basis, which would lure you into this false sense that, well, not everything is about race. But if you identify by color, logically, everything is about race.
So, and let's segue that into what Richard was talking about during the break, where he said that when he goes to the parts yard, then there are a lot of Hispanics, and so maybe that explains why what you say that they do there, where they say, "Okay, gringo, get the back of the line." They don't say that. They don't say that. They just do it. He said, "So you're saying that's not would that be racial, or would that be?" Because you said that's not racist, because race has white and black, the binary. So what is that? Is that racial, or is that just discriminatory and it's outside of the race paradigm? What would you say?
I would say that is discriminatory. It's definitely discriminatory. I'm not in the mindset of that Hispanic person in that example. So I don't know how that person would identify. Are they identifying by their culture? Or are they identifying by a race? Are they seeing this person as a gringo? Are they seeing him as a racial identity? So those things I don't have access to in terms of the mindset. However, it is most certainly discriminatory. At least it feels discriminatory, unless if you ask him directly, why did you wait to put me in the back of the line? And he has a plausible reason, which is highly doubtful. Now, if you can take that example and make it a systemic piece to where you are the only game in town, you are you are tax paying, or we pay your taxes, and no matter where we go, we are systemically being treated the same way. Where there's no other choice, there's no other option. This is where we have to go. That now becomes a power differential to where they hold power over you that is oppressive.
But is that power differential, that becomes subjective then? Because if when I go into that shop, there's automatically a power differential because the fact that they own the place, they run the place, they determine who's in line, they determine who gets served first, who gets served last. So there's already that power dynamic there. So why would that not be simply them exercising unjustly their power.
Well, yeah, that they're exercising their power in an individual discriminatory way. However, it is not systemic. There's not a systemic line of Hispanic-owned junkyards that gringos have to go to, right?
Show me where it's not.
Yeah, well, so wait. So, all right. So once again, but doesn't that become then subjective once again? Because how do you define systemic? Because if, that would almost be like the same thing that they did with not serving African Americans or Negroes during Jim Crow. Well, hey, we don't serve them here. You can go to the other one. And so, and if they were able to go to another one, then you could use that basis and say, well, it wasn't systemic because they could always go to another one.
Except that we know that wasn't the case. In Jim Crow, that was a systemic example. That's a perfect example to counter this Hispanic example, because not only was it discriminatory, but then there was a law written for it to be enforceable across the country. Now, if the Hispanic community could make a law to support gringos to the back of the line across the country, and it's passed, that now becomes systemic.
Okay, what about, let's bring it forward then. Let's talk about the lunch counter sit-ins. When the law had been changed, however, people were doing the same thing and saying, we don't serve you here. Now, the law says that, that is forbidden, but they said you can always go to your own place. So now you got the law. So does that mean it was no longer systemic then?
You just confused me with that example.
Yeah, well, of course, in the 60s, you had Greensboro, you had the lunch counter sit-ins that were happening. And they were, and their whole basis for sitting at these lunch counters, which started in Greensboro, North Carolina, at the Woolworth counter there. Yeah. And they were saying, we don't serve you all here. But these people were sitting there and said, we're going to sit here until you do serve us. And so because you said that you said it was not systemic with the junkyard because they didn't own all the junkyards.
No, it's not systemic because it was not written into a official legal practice. Okay, when you have a prejudice that can be supported through its system, and it's deemed as legal, and there's no illegal consequences, that becomes systemic. So that whether it happens in Greensboro or it happens in New York, if it's the same piece, the same type of service, and where it's more collusory in nature, that becomes systemic.
Okay, so then it's almost like boom, that's a good one. Because right now people are saying that this is a systemic problem of police injustice, police, killing African Americans. But what you're saying, that can't be systemic because it's not codified in law that they have the authorization to do this. That is not, how can that be systemic if it's totally against the law if they were doing this thing inappropriately? How is that then systemic?
Well, actions are as actions do. Okay, so just because one says it's illegal, if, for example, this occurs across the country, the person who killed George Floyd had 18 previous abuse issues, served no consequences for them. So that shows a pattern and practice of systemic behavior that allows no consequences for abusive behavior. And so when you study those patterns, there's so many ways of getting around the legal wranglings of whatever law you're trying to put forth. So it's not so much what you write on paper as much as what is in a person's mind and heart. So you can't legislate a person's belief.
Right. So
and if a person believes that in the hierarchical distribution of power of white supremacy, just making a law is not going to change that. So again, there's plenty of data and statistics that show the same behavior that happened in George Floyd happens across the country. Right now, because of January 6th, they're finding also that in the law enforcement and in military, there has been a high saturation of recruitment of white nationalists to the point where the armed services had to have a stand down day just to deal with that issue and figure out how they're going to address this. That's a systemic pattern. That's a systemic behavior, a systemic practice that is allowed through the powers that be, because there's no way you're going to get me personally to believe that the leaders in these organizations didn't know that. Not when it becomes that permeated in their hiring practices, that now after January 6th, all of a sudden they're popping out of the woodworks. Somebody knew this way before January 6th.
Yeah, now I got a real big view on that, and I want to talk about that before we go to a break, though, because I think that they're wrong. I think that they're wrong, and I think that they were wrong to talk about a stand down, and I think that they're wrong to talk about that is deeply embedded in our military service. Of course, I come from the military service, all right? So 20 years as a Marine, and I think that they're wrong. Doesn't mean that they are, but I think that they are. Okay, so
well, and again, that's the important point about this work. It's not so much that everybody sees it the same way, because everybody's going to come from their own experiences. The purpose of my work is to effect change, not to argue a point to its death until somebody walks away the victor. Okay, these 8 tenets are for a collective roadmap. Some will agree, some will not agree. But if we're in agreement that we need to address race in our organization, race in our community, I'm proposing this method as an effective way to get forward motion. Because what happens, and it was just demonstrated in this discussion, if we make it a subjective discussion about, well, I don't think it, because see, I believe, and because, well, see, I went through this, and that is an interesting discussion. It's certainly worthy of merit, to sit down and discuss that. But ultimately, those discussions go nowhere. You start and leave where you started. We're trying to move forward. So for this to work, we're going with what is most plausible. All right. People who identify as white getting discriminated in Hispanic junkyards typically is not hitting the frontline news. As great as an example as that is, in terms of area of importance and what's occurring in our society, that's not a huge issue, okay? What is a huge issue are the plethora of expressions of white supremacy that are permeating all of our systems. Now,
okay, hey George, hold your thoughts. Well, because we got to go to commercial break. Hurry up.
Okay.
Oh, we got to go commercial break.
But when I say these things, I'm never coming from a judgmental perspective. I'm just coming from objective truth. It's just a fact.
Okay.
I'm not trying to blame anybody.
Right. All right. And we'll continue there as soon as we come back from the break. All right. We'll continue right there.
Edge Radio TV is holding auditions for new show hosts. Are you a subject matter expert, professional, influencer, book author, thought leader, or business owner with an educational or motivational platform? Then we want to meet you. Send a link of some of your work to edgeradio20@gmail.com and be sure to put audition in the subject line. Join the Edge Radio TV family. Edge TV, because truth still matters.
Well, welcome back to Talk About Unity, and I got to come straight in here because otherwise I'll lose my thought. Because George was saying, talking about how some things are not the prevailing sentiment that we have in our country at this time. And so my question to George is about, whoa, how do you keep my microphone from falling over? That's my question for you, George. And it's swinging
That's
back and
racism.
forth. I bump this thing every
microphone.
week. I don't know. And you never bump yours. What is it? What's the deal on that? All right.
We'll swap next week.
See, now that's got my thoughts. So let me get back on what I was talking about. But George, do we stand the chance of allowing only the prevailing narrative to be the one that we pay attention to in trying to resolve some of these issues as we go forward? Because my whole point that started you when I was talking about the military, how I believe that what's happening out there is a prevailing narrative that everybody submits to, which I don't believe is the narrative that offers the solution. And I think the prevailing narrative is one that we were talking about earlier that simply deals with symptoms and doesn't get to the solution. And that's why I was saying I was coming from the context of my experience. I understand my experience, but my experience was going to be put in proper context of what I believe is the actual narrative that needs resolving out there. And so what do you think?
Well, when we have discussions like these, what's going on is people are doing the reverse engineering of the problem. So starting with what you're seeing and then trying to work backwards. And it doesn't always work that way because it ends up becoming an even Steven tit for tat. Well, what about this? What about that? I'm not dismissing it. I'm saying let's work the other way around. Instead of working from outside in, let's work from inside out. So that if your feeling is valid, this process that I'm promoting will get to the root of that. But when we just go by, well, this is what my opinion is, this is what I feel, well, this happened to me over there, so why isn't that? That is a non-productive way of addressing the issue. Because for me, it is never about who's right or who's wrong. It doesn't feel good to be discriminated against in any capacity. So by no means am I saying, well, quit your crying, quit your whining, that's nothing. Let's go to the important stuff. I'm not saying that.
Right.
What I'm saying is let's have a structured, methodical approach rather than just grabbing incidents from here, incidents from there, and having these subjective-based discussions. Let's have a more methodical, sequentially, internal-based discussion based on objective fact. And then from there, we can have a more introspective look at a variety of examples, because all of it is important.
And so in the paradigm that is binary, the binary black and white, then is it equipped then to handle those outliers to that? And so how do you handle those outliers? Because if we say the prevailing narrative is that police officers do this to African Americans, and so when something happened to a Caucasian American, does that get covered up as we address the entire piece of the pie, I guess, as you're talking about?
Well, it goes back to where you're starting. And even though I haven't gotten there yet, well, number 6, it kind of addresses, if you identify by color, black or white, that's where it starts, guys. So probably between the three of us, I know for a fact that I am not discussing anything through a racial paradigm, through a racial lens. So when I bring up examples, I'm never coming from a racial identity perspective. And that's what many are missing, because when you tell a story about the junkyard, you're coming from your own racial perspective. You're probably identifying as white and looking at them through a racial lens and assuming that they're looking at you through a racial lens. So everything you have experienced is inside the race paradigm. And it's hard to have an objective-based discussion leading to a solution when both sides are in their own camps. Well, I'm not coming from a camp on either side.
Well, actually, we're not going to take a lot of time to pick up, do an autopsy on that particular issue. But what had happened, right, I didn't understand what was going on. When that was happening to me at the junkyard, I didn't understand immediately what was going on until I saw with my own eyes the other people being funneled in front of me. But then also the issue, which really I should have brought up, was a better example in Uvalde, which is 90 miles from the border. My friend Victor, who happens to be Hispanic, a very close friend, was standing next to me. I didn't understand what was going on. He says, "Hang on a second, let me take care of this." He steps up, he's speaking to them, and basically we're in, we're out. And he apologized. He says, "I'm sorry." He says, "I'm sorry this happened to you." I go, "What happened?" And then he says, "Well, it's because you're white." I was not looking at it from a racial perspective. Right. I was just, why am I not getting any service? That's where I was coming from. So
yeah.
So can people thrust us into the race paradigm? That makes us. Can we be thrust into the race paradigm? Somebody might have done something to me. I wasn't thinking race, but when I realized they did this, and like they did with Richard and said, "Hey, they did this to you because of your skin color," is he now thrust into the race paradigm, or can he still remain outside of that if he addresses it? If he says, "You did this to me because I was white," is he now a race paradigm practitioner, or is he not? Because I'm almost saying, some of these things, like I have this organization called E.R.A.S.E.
Right.
I think I'm outside of the race paradigm, but because I'm saying we need to get rid of this concept, does that then thrust me inside of the paradigm? It's kind of like,
I'm not going to say.
Great question.
Yeah.
You're the cognitive behavioral therapist. You got to tell me about myself.
I love these questions. I love great questions. So I just get excited hearing them. So, and there's often not just one right answer or one wrong answer. Okay. There's a lot of variables that depend on that. Now, it depends on the identity of the person in the environment. If you're in America, 9 times out of 10, everything you do is racially based, even when that's not what you're thinking. Race does not have to be in your conscious mind, your conscious thoughts, for it to have impact. Actually, it's the exact opposite. All it needs is your subconscious embracement. And that usually begins with racial identity. Most of us, even those who don't want to admit it, identify either as white or as Black. And when we're in our communities, workplaces, entertainment places, we're being perceived in one of those 2 boxes. So on some level, we're always at all times dealing with a racial component in our society.
Is it possible for a guy like me to be non-racial? So, that's the question. I would say I'm non-racial. Is that possible? Based on is that possible?
Yes, it is possible. However, because you haven't gone all the way through my process, you're not
it's
there
possible,
yet.
But you got to have George Middleton's deconstruction class.
You're not there yet. But yes, because and being non-racial doesn't mean that you don't have to address race, because this is about how you respond, not about, everybody tries to make it like, let's attack race, let's be anti-race, let's dismantle race. All that does is give race more power. It gives it more validity.
Well, how? Okay, so let me ask you this. So, George, from the outset, are there people on this planet, and especially in America, who are not racial, period? Who do not, are you saying 100% of American citizens need to go through deconstruction of race? 100% in America?
No doubt. Yes. Now, the type of. But George, let me answer your question.
Okay,
go ahead.
How can that be true though? When you have some people who are born without the idea of this race at all and have lived that way continually.
Give me an example.
And I'm thinking particularly of what we call.
Give me an example of people here in America. Give me an example of people here in America who were born and not thrust into a racial paradigm.
Biracial couple. I think about my grandson Beckett. And so he'll be 4.
I remember you referring to your grandson as biracial.
Yes. What I'm saying. Yes.
So that means he's thrust into a racial paradigm.
No, and I refer to him. No, but what I'm saying is Beckett himself, I'm not talking about the world outside of him, because I'm bringing it to the point that there are some people in this world who have no idea. And specifically, when you start talking about children under the age of 3, then all of them have been brought into it. I've got another couple who just had what we would call biracial. However, so I'm saying in that environment where they grew up with a parent that is dark, a parent that is light, then it's very easy for them to grow up in a different world than the world that we grew up in, where those things were identified as black and white, because they have no.
So then your example of a group of people who are non-racial are those born under the age of 3.
Well, what I'm saying is, but some of those 3-year-olds become 17 years old, 20-year-olds, 30s, and 40-year-olds who grew up in that environment and have never, ever subscribed to the race paradigm. And I'm saying there are people like that exist. And I'm saying, so I would think that some people have lived their lives outside of the race paradigm, even in America. And that's my contention.
Well, I mean, that's a nice theory, and I'm not going to dismiss it. But I wouldn't say it's a valid one as of yet. I would need to see some proof of that, because here in America, our society is based purely on race. Everything is about race. Everything you do, everywhere you try to register, check in, apply, everything is based on race.
Yeah, and does that
mean that 100% of Americans agree with race? I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that we are all thrust into a racial paradigm.
Oh, I would agree.
To get to your first question, which was, is it possible to be non-racial? The type of group of individuals that most closely come to that ability are those who are already fully intact with their cultural ethnic identity. So if you were born outside of this country and you learned a language other than English, most likely you are fully intact and knowledgeable about your cultural identity. And why that's important is because many that come from these countries into America are being thrust into a racial paradigm right off the bat. But because they understand who they actually are, they understand their cultural identity, they're more effective in addressing racial issues. They're not as reactive. They are not as emotionally traumatized in areas of race, because they have a different factor of emotional resiliency, of knowing who they really are, having their own internal community support system. If you ask the average person born in America who identifies either as black or as white, what cultural origins do they adhere to? Most of them wouldn't have a clue. Well, I think my mother's German, or my grandparents were from, I'm not really sure. Because most people born in America are totally severed from their cultural connections.
Yeah, 23andMe is helping that. Ancestry.com is helping that. And after we come back, hey, I'm going to have to ask the boss if we can run over today, because we got so much to talk about. Natural Nation's supposed to come up next. Maybe we can steal some of their time so we can keep covering this. Because when we come back, we're going to get to point 7. And because, we started out at point 6 and we're still on the same point. We've been 40 minutes deep. All right, so we'll be right after the break and we'll continue the discussion. Talk about unity.
The Natural Nation Network is really about taking control of your health physically, spiritually, emotionally, even intellectually, because there's so much out there in misinformation. There's a lot of people now that are suffering from all sorts of diseases that they really wouldn't have to suffer for if they had better information. And that's what we're here to do. Provide information that can save lives.
The mind and the body are totally connected.
Health can be really serious, and sometimes we just have to lighten it up a little bit while we're still providing substantive information.
And my sort of mantra on the salsa dance floor is kind of similar. I tell somebody, if you make a mistake twice, it becomes a move. Okay.
Tune into Natural Nation every Tuesday at 11 a.m.
Hey, welcome back to Talk About Unity, where we've been on the mic for a while and we've covered one point. So, but that's all right, because at one point we covered a lot of area, and it's a lot of great education, because when you all play this video back, and you'll have to watch it because we got George Middleton on, everything he says you got to listen to like 4 or 5 times before it assimilates, all right, before you get it.
Some of it I get right away, but some of it
when you think you get it right away, he'll say the next thing, you go, oh, well, maybe I didn't get that. You'll find out you didn't get that.
Well, I love this.
But hey, we're going to get to point 7, all right? So we got point 7 and point 8. We'll see if we make it without running over to Natural Nation, which is the next show behind us here at Edge Radio. And point 7 is, you said that, and make sure I got this right before we go forward. It says disproportionate. When we talk about disproportionate, it refers to systems and not the people being serviced by the system. We're talking about disproportionate impacts that happen to people because of the system that's in place, and not the people necessarily being serviced by the system. And so before we discuss it, though, I want to put this quote up, and I want you to put this in context. You'll see this quote coming up. We got a graphic with Denzel Washington. If you can read that, hopefully you can see that. Read that quote by Denzel Washington, and I'll go ahead and read it for everybody, so that in case you can't have trouble seeing it, I'll read through it. One of the things, and this is Denzel Washington talk about, Denzel kind of gets in trouble because of the things he says, which Denzel, I believe, kind of operates outside of the race paradigm. Now, of course, he says some things, because anytime you say my people or whatever, then it means you're inside the race paradigm. But I think his ideology is very non-racial. All right. He was in that movie, The Equalizer, the second one. He made this great line where he grabbed this kid. I think it was the second one. Was the first one where he had the young kid he was mentoring, and he told him, he got on the kid about, you can't blame the white man, can't blame your mama, can't blame, I was like, that's Denzel. He's talking good stuff. But anyway, he says here in this quote, he says, one of the things that saddens me the most about my people is fathers that don't take care of their sons and daughters. And you can't blame that on the man or getting frisked. Take responsibility, look in the mirror, and say, what can I do better? There is opportunity, you can make it. That's a Denzel quote. So in view of our that 7th point that you're talking about, disproportionate refers to the systems, is that, I'm thinking, is that system, which I call the family, is that system, can it supersede the cultural system or the country's system, that other system that's out there? Can you create a system that supersedes those other systems?
So that statement is rich with lessons and perspectives that I know we won't be able to cover with the time we have left on this show. However,
I'm gonna have to make you a regular so you come back every week, George, or something like that. I mean, you're gonna have to make you a regular so we can cover all that.
As I always like to say, when dealing with systemic issues, we have to have systemic solutions. And your show is one of the systemic aspects of a solution. So I would love to be part of this format as often as possible, because this is a hugely important issue to deal with the big, most pressing issues down to the minute, petty issues of race, because they're all important. And we're all at different stages in this process of race. And so some people are, maybe a little lower, some people are a little higher. It's not an issue of better or worse, it's just different. So we need to we can't have a one size fits all approach in addressing this issue. But now, as far as this statement, that statement can be true and have nothing to do with the outcome impact of disproportionate treatment and disparities. So often, again, that's why trying to reverse engineer the process leads you in a train wreck. Because right now, most people, when we talk about this in any depth, haven't really embraced points 1 and 2. So without really internally and mentally embracing points 1 and 2, you're going to look at all of these from a racial mindset. And race pretends to have logic, but there's no logic in the system.
Let me interrupt right quick there, George. All right, so and when I say the systems, will one system prevent you from the other system? So what I'm looking at is something like this: when they talk about the disparities of incarceration, could one of the rationales, like let's say that disparity, because people use that disparity as a reason to say that there is in fact racism, they use that as the basis. But I'm saying, is it possible that this other system, the home system, where boys are growing up without fathers, could then impact and be a rational justification for the disparity in that system? And maybe it is not, in fact, that racial thing that we identified.
It's not about justifying, it's about verifying, okay? And yes, the home environment, the community environment, is a direct correlation with the type of disparities we're talking about. So again, if we're talking about this disproportionate treatment and disparity outcomes in law enforcement, there is statistically based, valid, objective research that shows that the system of law enforcement treats the racially demographic Black community in much more disproportionate ways than it does any other community, which leads to the disparities in outcomes. It's just an objective fact. That is referring to the behavior of law enforcement. Now, what law enforcement will do, and what a lot of people who aren't in law enforcement will use as a justification, is to say, well, that's because there's more crime in these areas.
Well, and that'd be the question. Is there a correlation between crime and fatherhood?
Well, that's a different, see, that's another rabbit hole.
But while it's a rabbit hole, if we discard that.
But just a minute. I'm not discarding it. I'm putting it in its proper perspective. Because again, hear me out. Because this is what I'm trying to get people to avoid. Discussions where you start seamlessly tying in all of these individual behaviors and trends into one area. Bottom line, disproportionate treatment and disparities. And this is not my opinion.
But George, what I'm saying is, I understand that. What I'm saying is, but if we never look at the precipitating factors and we only say,
I'm not saying not to do that.
We only say this is the fact.
I'm not saying not to do that.
So
who's saying to do that? Well, but that's not. This isn't the time.
So my question,
to look. Listen, this is not the time to look at precipitating factors. We're talking about the 8 tenets of racial deconstruction. We're not trying to score points. We're not trying to prove points. We're not trying to prove narratives, because until you've done 1 and 2, your narratives are going to be invalid. They're going to be biased. They're going to come from biased, racially oriented perspectives that keep you from taking a more objective approach, being able to deal with just one issue at a time. when I'm dealing with one issue and someone wants to bring in, well, what about this? And what about that? And what about this? That's a clear sign that they're not following a sequential method that I'm proposing. Just because I'm saying let's deal with this does not mean I'm dismissing that. Mm-hmm. But we have to put things in their proper perspective. Then it makes sense. But again, most people are coming not from the mindset of points 1 and 2. As much as they might really want to try, mm-hmm. It takes work to do that. It takes work to do that. So we can't start with the end in mind. You got to start at the beginning. First, be honest about how you see yourself in relationship to race. So that is the most difficult, challenging part of this process.
So if race is not real, then the whole phrase and the whole concept of Black Lives Matter isn't real.
So that's a great one. That's a great one because I'm working in my community, often with organizations that self-title themselves racially, because many in our community look at Black as a cultural term. Now, part of that is understandable because historically, when Africans were brought over, they were forcibly stripped from their culture. They were not allowed to practice their own cultural ways. They were told, and then the term then was not Black, it was Negro. And Negro is Spanish for Black, okay? And they were told that they were Negro. They were no longer Yoruba. They were no longer Zulu, okay?
Or Igbo, which is me, by the way,
Igbo, Nigerian. They were not told, they were told not that they could know, they had to reject all of those teachings and all those belief systems, okay? So now, because that's been practiced generationally, you see this weird phenomenon. You'll see those in our community, the racially demographic Black community, tie their identity to this color. However, funny is those who identify as white, you very rarely see them say, well, this is the white New York Fire Department. This is the white New York Police Department. This is the white, this is the white radio station W, white people ZL, okay? Because it's just taken for granted that is the standard. So when you're the standard, you don't have to say your name. When you're made to believe you're the minority, you're grasping for anything to empower yourself. And we have mistakenly grasped a racial label in a weak and ineffective attempt to empower ourselves. So Black Lives Matter, their intent is well-meaning, well-based. But because they have taken on a label that really perpetuates the very thing they want to eradicate, it's become self-sabotaging.
Yep, very good. Very good explanation.
The way that I'm processing this as a pastor, the way I'm processing it with my congregation, when there's an injustice that's levied upon somebody, regardless of the color of their skin, I ask them to ask this question: if that was your son, if that was your daughter, if that was your wife, how would you engage that situation? How would you respond to that? How would you speak to that? What would be your approach if that was your take? And that completely obliterates culture, color, race, any of that, because it's all about human beings. When I was asked the question, I'm going to be real fast. When I was asked the question in a aggressive tone, the first time I ever heard it was at Sandra Bland's funeral when we were ministering there and loving on the family. One of the ladies there, I feel misguided, while I was behind the podium, said, do you believe, and very aggressively, do you believe Black Lives Matter? I said, absolutely Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter too. Oh, she didn't want to hear any of that. But where I have evolved in my tenor, my conviction, my feeling about it all, Black lives absolutely do matter. Okay, unborn Black babies matter. Unwed pregnant wives matter. Black orphan children matter. Kids without fathers matter. Black men that aren't allowed to see their children matter. Black parents that are in nursing homes that are dying of COVID matter. They all matter.
Let me interject here.
But George, what that means, George, wait, hold it, George. I'm gonna let you close out the show because we're running out of time again. No. But exactly what Richard was expressing and exactly what you were saying before, all of these to me is for the objective listener or viewer watching the show are going to say, that's why we got to get rid of this race concept because all these things.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead, George.
And that's why I want to say. That's why I want to say this. And this is a harsh reality, and I know for some this is going to really just like this guy is really crazy. Turn this show off. But I got to say,
I got you. I'll translate for him.
In race ideology, Black lives do not matter. That's just the bottom line, guys. In race ideology, that's one of the racial oxymorons that we keep bumping our head into, and that's why I'm trying to promote this new thought about race ideology. Right. We're trying to take race and make it be this warm, fuzzy, nice little racial reconciling, kumbaya.
Yeah, can't do it.
And that's we're sabotaging ourselves. Right. So you're saying you're pastoring a church,
yes,
and you're trying to use these scriptural philosophical points that have merit. But here's the problem. If they identify as white, that's going to cancel out all of your spiritual perspectives.
Yeah.
Because everything in a person that is white identity is antithetical to a scriptural perspective.
Yep. Right.
But we try to make it that way.
Right.
We believe we can actually be a white Christian. We believe we can actually be a Black Christian. And those are racially, spiritually oxymorons.
Yes.
Because the two identities do not mix, but we keep trying to make them mix. And that's why Sunday still today in 2021 is the most segregated day of the week. Even though we are nice people, we're good people, we love people, but come Sunday, you'll see your real belief system come to play in most churches today.
Very good. That's outstanding, George. All right, so that's really good stuff there. And we're going to have to play that back a few times. But George, I'm going to have you back every week, man. So you need to block this out on your schedule. I don't know if it'll be this week, but hey, you were just listening to George Middleton here on Talk About Unity with Richard Jennings, and just great discussion. Replay it a few times. We didn't get to point 8, and so I'm going to see. I don't know if it'll be next week, but we got to get George back because I want to cover point 8, which we didn't get to, where he says you cannot reduce the impact of race by ignoring it. So that's going to be interesting. So that's going to be really good. So Vince, we're going to have, I don't know, next week. So we're not going to do that this week. Our time's out. He gave us extra time. We ran over, and I knew that would happen. So, George, I'll be talking to you. And on Talk About Unity, we might catch you all with George Milton again next week. We'll see. So stay tuned for next week. Talk About Unity.